Hi guys, this is Creative Cuts, a channel where I build, paint and create things. In today's video, I'm going to take a journey back in time to one of my favourite periods of history and earn a few good karma points along the way. Ancient Egypt absolutely fascinates me, full of mystery and intrigue. So when a friend of mine asked me if I could build him a book nook with an Egyptian theme, I jumped at the chance. If you're new here and you like these kind of build videos, then you can subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest videos, give the video a like, and let me know in the comments below if there is a particular theme you would like to see me build. I had a vague idea of creating a tomb entrance with some LEDs inside to give a bit of light. I had an offcut of thin MDF that would work great as a base and also as a box for the book nook. I wanted to create a sense of depth and grandeur, but I had a pretty limited space to work with. The proportions were also pretty constrained, so a bit of planning was needed to find a way of including the elements of detail and how to compose them in an oddly shaped box. I came up with the idea for a tomb with a sarcophagus and high walls with lots of hieroglyphs. But first, I needed to have a base to work on. I cut the various parts of my box. Next, with full gusto, I ploughed ahead with putting my box together with some wood glue. I even got out my precision set square to get everything nice and true. I clamped all this together and let the glue set. And as I sat there admiring my little box, feeling rather happy with myself, I had the sudden realization that building in a box would be impossible, as I could barely even get my hand in, let alone work at any level of detail. So, after a quick facepalm, I pulled my box apart and started again. Wow, I didn't even get past the first step in this video without screwing up. But I left this part in because I wanted to show you guys that even after building many models, diorama building can be a bit of a labyrinth. Sometimes you hit a dead end and you have to start again. I changed tack and went to my 3D printer to find some cool Egyptian models. I found these two seated statues, some obelisks, and some cool texture rollers for hieroglyphs. I've never used a roller like this, so I wanted to give it a go. How cool is it to be able to print your own tools? However, be careful, as I mistakenly printed out several files with great looking hieroglyphs, only to realise that these needed to be in reverse to print hieroglyphs that looked like they were carved into the wall. So, using my models for scale, I began to lay out my design and try to visualise what it might look like. I grabbed some XPS foam and began to add some basic shapes to my tomb. Making any themed build relies on adding specific elements readily associated with that theme. There is a limit to what you can include because of space, so you have to edit down those elements to really tell your story. For me, one of the first things I think about with regard to ancient Egypt is hieroglyphs. Now, to carve these in by hand would be difficult and time consuming. So I wanted a way to easily reproduce symbols on the walls. I came up with the idea to try and spread out an even layer of modelling clay onto my boards, which I could then roll my roller over in one go. Makes sense in theory, but in practice, this wasn't as straightforward as I thought. After a bit of trial and error, I found the easiest way was to first smear the modelling putty on by hand, and then roll over it with some oven paper and a flat surface. Then, with a deep breath, I rolled out my roller and was really happy with the result. I also heavily underestimated the amount of putty it would take to fully cover the walls. I used my favourite modelling putty, Magic Sculpt, as it holds details amazingly. But this product isn't cheap, and I'd used most of it on one wall alone. So I knew I had to come up with an alternative. I switched to Milliput for the rest of the walls, which is much cheaper and gave me somewhat similar results. I wanted to add some lighting, and I had an old set of Christmas lights that would be perfect for this. I drilled a hole to thread the wire through the back panel and transferred this hole onto my foam base. I then carefully carved out a channel around the side of my base for my wires to run. I also built up some steps to lead into my tomb. This was simply carved out of a single piece of foam. I used a nail file to smooth down some of the edges. Then I bundled up the LEDs into little groups to give them a little bit more light and began to distribute them around the model. I put little holes into the base of my model and then also burrowed these holes from the side to create little tunnels for the lights to sit into. I used a hole punch for this, as it made making the holes really easy. I then wanted something to direct the light upwards onto the walls. I had some square tubes of styrene that I thought would be great for this, as they are easy to cut, especially with my styrene guillotine. I taped up the bundles of LEDs with some electrical tape to hold it together, and then carefully inserted these into my styrene uplighters. However, I noticed a problem immediately after switching the lights on to test. The walls of the styrene tube were too thin and allowed a lot of light to seep through. A cool effect, but definitely not what I wanted here. So to rectify the problem, I glued on little strips of card to block the light. I crafted some huge blocks for the ceiling of my chamber. The Egyptians were amazing craftspeople. Their skill and precision is unmatched to this day, and many studies have struggled to explain how they manipulated huge 100-ton blocks with apparent ease in their construction. Something that would be extremely difficult to, even with today's technology and machinery. And yet, the Egyptians did this thousands of years ago. I began to add little architectural details by using more cardboard and bits of foam. I had to really think about how all these elements would eventually fit together, and had to make lots of little adjustments to allow for overlap and tight solid fits. I also had to think about how to create the entrance of the tomb which felt solid and yet would still allow me to paint the inside of my tomb. I figured that I could make the rocks and then hide the seams once it was all glued together. I made a thin template out of card, and I could easily cut this to shape as needed. I clamped the sides together to give me the shape of the box, and then started to glue on little bits of foam which I could then carve into rocks later. Once I had a rough shape in place, I took a sharp knife and started to carve out some rock shapes. Roughing up the surface really helps to create texture, and XPS foam is a fantastic material to do this with, as it cuts so easily. With everything laid out in front of me, it all looked a bit weird, but somehow I felt confident that it would come together. I loaded up my airbrush with some primer and gave everything a solid base coat. Once the primer was dry, I gave all the panels a couple of thin coats of a sandy colour. And while I had the paints out, I gave the sarcophagus a good coat of gold, and once everything was a more uniform colour, I felt better immediately. Once dry, I mixed up an oil wash. Super simple, just some thinner, in this case white spirit, and a small amount of black and brown oil paint. I love oil washes because they flow into all the details so much better than water-based washes. And then it was time for final assembly. I started to glue all my elements into place. I used the floor tiles that I'd carved into the base to help me line everything up evenly. I also glued on my uplighters. And slowly I was at a point where I could glue the main box of the Book Nook together. This way of building feels completely counterintuitive to me, as I usually like to build something from the ground up essentially and let my ideas form as I build. Being able to visualize what is taking form in front of you and respond accordingly is crucial to the way I work. However, on this build I had to really plan my steps in advance and build everything in pieces, so to see it all come together was great. I then took some filler and used my finger to smooth everything into place. And after the filler was dry, I gave all the surfaces a really solid coat of Mod Podge. This is a great modelling product as it primes and seals and gives you a uniform base to paint over. This is especially important when using a combination of materials, like filler and foam for example, as these two materials have different absorption rates. Filler is extremely porous, so it will absorb much more paint than foam, giving you two different colours when painted together. And then I finished off the entrance with the tomb by giving it a quick coat of paint, in this case with a spray can. Now, why didn't I use my airbrush like I did before? No reason, just that it was to hand and that's what I grabbed in the moment. We're all complex creatures, what can I say? And finally I gave the outside a coat of black. I really enjoyed this build, as it made me think about different ways of building from what I would naturally gravitate to. It's good to challenge yourself. I've definitely learnt a lot and made many mistakes along the way. But if you have enjoyed this video and would like to see more like this, then subscribe, hit the like button to let YouTube know where the good stuff is. And lastly, on a personal note, to all you lovely people out there, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your kind words of encouragement and amazing support is what keeps my passion for this hobby so strong. Thank you for watching. See you all soon and enjoy.